behind the gilded gates of Windsor Castle, while the world watches every public appearance and carefully staged photo opportunity. A different kind of royal education is taking place in the shadows. Prince George, second in line to the British throne, is undergoing preparation unlike any heir before him. This isn't about learning protocol or mastering the art of ribbon-cutting ceremonies. This is about forging a future king who must navigate a rapidly changing world where ancient traditions clash with modern realities. What the cameras don't capture are the early morning training sessions, the classified briefings, and the carefully selected mentors who are shaping not just a prince, but a leader who may one day rule over nations facing unprecedented challenges. The question isn't whether George will be king, it's whether he'll be ready for a throne that demands more than ceremony and tradition. This is the untold story of how a young prince is being prepared for the weight of a crown, away from public scrutiny, in ways that would surprise even the most devoted royal watchers. The monarchy's survival may depend on getting this preparation exactly right. The morning alarm buzzed at 5:30, just as it had every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 8 months. Prince George Alexander Louis rolled over in his bed at Adelaide Cottage, rubbing sleep from his eyes as the first hints of dawn crept through the heavy curtains. Most 11-year-olds would groan and pull covers over their heads, but George had learned that being second in line to the throne came with responsibilities that couldn't wait for a more reasonable hour. Down the hallway, his parents, Prince William and Catherine, were already moving about quietly, their own morning routines carefully coordinated to ensure George's special training remained invisible to the outside world. The media believed the young prince was simply attending Lambrook School like any other privileged child, excelling in his studies and enjoying cricket matches on weekends. They had no idea that twice a week before the sun fully rose, George was receiving an education that no textbook could provide. George dressed quickly in plain clothes, nothing that would identify him as royalty to any casual observer. Dark jeans, a simple jumper, and trainers that had seen better days. His protection officer, known only as Mitchell, waited by the kitchen door with a thermos of hot chocolate and a knowing smile. Mitchell had been with the family for 3 years now, long enough to understand that this particular assignment was unlike any other in the Royal Protection Service. The drive through the countryside took 40 minutes, winding through villages still cloaked in morning mist. George pressed his face to the tinted window, watching early commuters beginning their day. Dog walkers navigating empty streets and delivery trucks making their rounds. These were his future subjects, people living ordinary lives who had no idea their future king was observing them from the back seat of an unmarked Range Rover. Their destination appeared unremarkable from the outside. Millbrook Training Facility looked like dozens of other converted country estates scattered across the home counties. The Georgian facade gave no hint of the sophisticated operation housed within its walls. To anyone checking records, it was listed as a private educational consultancy specializing in leadership development for young people from prominent families. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more secretive. Colonel James Hartwell met them at the entrance, his bearing unmistakably military despite wearing civilian clothes. At 52, Hartwell had served in the Special Air Service for 15 years before transitioning to a role that officially didn't exist. His job was to prepare the future king for challenges that previous monarchs never could have imagined, using methods that would have scandalized courtiers from earlier generations. George had initially been intimidated by Hartwell's intense demeanor and clipped manner of speaking. The colonel didn't treat him like a child, or show the deference that George had grown accustomed to from palace staff. Instead, Hartwell treated him like a future head of state who needed to understand the weight of responsibility that would one day rest on his shoulders. Inside the facility, other young people were already engaged in various activities. These were children of diplomats, military leaders, and intelligence officials, each receiving specialized training tailored to their future roles. George was the only one whose identity was kept strictly confidential, known to the other trainees simply as Arthur, a name chosen for its historical significance. The first session of the day was always current affairs, but not the sanitized version taught in traditional schools. Hartwell and his team presented George with real intelligence briefings, simplified but authentic, showing him how world events connected and influenced each other. Today's briefing focused on climate change and its impact on Commonwealth nations, particularly small island states facing rising sea levels. George studied satellite images of the Maldives, learning how an entire nation could disappear within his lifetime. He read reports about climate refugees and economic disruption, understanding for the first time that being king might involve making decisions about where displaced populations could relocate and how resources should be allocated. These weren't abstract policy discussions, but real challenges he would likely face during his reign. Sarah Chen, a former Foreign Office analyst, guided George through the geopolitical implications of environmental change. She spoke plainly about how climate issues were creating new alliances and conflicts, how access to fresh water was becoming a source of international tension, and how the monarchy's role in these discussions could be crucial. George found himself asking questions he'd never considered before, realizing that wearing a crown meant more than attending state dinners and opening parliament. Physical training came next, though this wasn't ordinary exercise. Major Rebecca Walsh, formerly of the Royal Marines, had designed a program that would prepare George for the physical demands of royal duties, while also building the kind of resilience he might need in crisis situations. The training covered everything from maintaining stamina during long ceremonial events to basic survival skills that might be necessary if he ever found himself in dangerous situations. George learned to rappel down walls, navigate obstacle courses designed to simulate emergency evacuations, and practice situational awareness techniques used by security professionals. He wasn't being trained as a soldier, but rather as someone who needed to maintain composure and make clear decisions under physical and mental stress. The exercises were challenging enough to push his limits without overwhelming a boy who was still growing into his teenage years. During one session, Walsh had George practice walking steadily while carrying increasing weights, simulating the physical burden of heavy ceremonial robes and regalia during lengthy state occasions. She explained how previous monarchs had fainted during important ceremonies due to inadequate physical preparation, and how such incidents could undermine public confidence in the institution. The afternoon brought George's favorite part of the training, though he'd never admit it to his parents. Dr. Marcus Webb, a professor of psychology from Cambridge, conducted sessions on understanding human behavior and motivation. Webb taught George to read body language, recognize deception, and understand the psychological dynamics that drove both individual behavior and crowd movements. These skills weren't about manipulation, but about effective communication and leadership. George practiced conversations with adult volunteers who role-played as various types of people he might encounter during his reign. Labor union leaders with legitimate grievances, foreign dignitaries with hidden agendas, religious figures seeking influence, and ordinary citizens facing personal crises all required different approaches and levels of empathy. Through careful observation and practice, George was learning to identify when someone was nervous, angry, or hiding important information. More importantly, he was developing the ability to respond appropriately to these emotional states, building the kind of emotional intelligence that would serve him well in countless future interactions. Dr. Webb also introduced George to concepts of power and responsibility that weren't covered in traditional royal education. They discussed how authority could be used constructively or destructively, how public perception shaped political reality, and how individual decisions by monarchs had historically influenced the course of nations. These conversations were sophisticated beyond George's years, but Webb had a gift for making complex ideas accessible without talking down to his young pupil. Technology training occupied the final session of each visit to Millbrook. The monarchy had sometimes struggled to adapt to new forms of communication and social media, often seeming out of touch with younger generations who consumed information differently than their parents and grandparents. George's training included understanding how information spread through digital networks, how public opinion could be shaped by social media campaigns, and how monarchs could use technology to maintain relevance without compromising dignity. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a former intelligence officer with expertise in cybersecurity, taught George about the digital threats that modern leaders faced. He learned about state-sponsored hacking, information warfare, and how foreign governments might attempt to influence public opinion about the monarchy through sophisticated online operations. These weren't distant theoretical concerns, but immediate realities that would shape his entire reign. Rodriguez also showed George how ordinary citizens used social media to discuss royal events, helping him understand how his actions and words would be interpreted and shared by millions of people within minutes of any public appearance. He practiced crafting messages that would resonate with different audiences, while avoiding language that could be misinterpreted or taken out of context. The drive back to Adelaide Cottage always felt too short. George's mind buzzed with new information and perspectives that he couldn't discuss with his school friends or even his siblings. He carried a secret that isolated him in ways that other children couldn't understand, but also connected him to a larger purpose that made the isolation bearable. His parents were always waiting when he returned, eager to hear about his day, but careful not to probe too deeply into classified aspects of his training. They trusted Hartwell and his team completely, understanding that George's preparation required expertise they couldn't provide themselves. William had his own memories of being unprepared for certain aspects of royal life, and he was determined that George would be better equipped for the challenges ahead. Catherine worried sometimes that they were forcing George to grow up too quickly, loading him with adult concerns while he was still a child. But she also recognized that his future subjects deserved a king who understood their world and could lead effectively during whatever crises emerged during his reign. The balance between preserving his childhood and preparing him for enormous responsibility required constant adjustment and careful monitoring. During family dinners, George sometimes struggled not to share insights from his training when his parents discussed current events or royal engagements. He had developed opinions and knowledge that went far beyond what would be expected from someone his age, but he had also learned the importance of discretion and timing in sharing information. His siblings Charlotte and Louis noticed that George sometimes seemed distant or preoccupied, but they attributed this to normal growing up rather than anything extraordinary. The family worked hard to maintain as much normalcy as possible, with George still doing homework, playing with friends, and engaging in typical childhood activities whenever his schedule allowed. The secret training was changing George in subtle but important ways. He paid closer attention to news broadcasts, asked more thoughtful questions about political developments, and showed increased interest in history and geography. His teachers at Lambrook noticed his growing maturity and intellectual curiosity, though they had no idea about the additional education he was receiving. Most significantly, George was beginning to understand that being king would require him to be more than a figurehead or ceremonial leader. He would need to be someone who could provide genuine leadership during national crises, offer wisdom during political upheavals, and serve as a unifying figure when the country faced internal divisions. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but his training was teaching him that he could carry that weight if he prepared properly. As winter approached and his training entered its 9th month, George had developed skills and knowledge that set him apart from any previous heir to the throne at his age. He could analyze intelligence reports, assess security threats, understand complex international relationships, and communicate effectively with people from vastly different backgrounds. More importantly, he was developing the emotional resilience and moral compass that would guide his decisions when he eventually wore the crown. The young prince was growing into someone who could lead Britain through whatever challenges the 21st century might bring, though he was still years away from fully understanding the magnitude of what lay ahead. His secret education was just beginning, with many more lessons and experiences waiting to shape him into the king his country would need. Spring brought new challenges and deeper layers to George's clandestine education. The 12-year-old prince had grown noticeably taller over the winter months, his voice beginning to crack occasionally during conversations, reminding everyone involved that he was transitioning from childhood toward the teenage years that would bring their own complications to his already complex life. Colonel Hartwell had expanded the training program based on George's progress and demonstrated capabilities. The twice-weekly sessions now sometimes extended into weekend-intensive workshops, always carefully disguised as family trips or private tutoring sessions. The cover stories were becoming more elaborate as George's education moved into areas that required longer periods of concentrated learning. The most significant addition to his curriculum was what Hartwell called crisis simulation exercises. These were elaborate scenarios designed to test George's decision-making abilities under pressure, using real historical events as templates but updated with contemporary challenges. The simulations were conducted in a purpose-built facility that could be reconfigured to represent various environments where George might need to provide leadership. The first major simulation placed George in the role of a monarch dealing with a natural disaster that had overwhelmed normal government response capabilities. The scenario was based loosely on the 2005 Hurricane Katrina disaster in the United States, but adapted to British circumstances with flooding across multiple regions of England caused by unprecedented storm systems linked to climate change. George sat at a conference table surrounded by actors playing roles of emergency services coordinators, military commanders, cabinet ministers, and international aid representatives. Each person presented him with competing demands for limited resources, conflicting information about the scope of the disaster, and political considerations that complicated purely humanitarian responses. He had to make decisions about evacuation priorities, resource allocation, international assistance requests, and public communications, while maintaining the dignity and constitutional neutrality expected of a monarch. The exercise was deliberately overwhelming, designed to show George how quickly situations could spiral beyond anyone's ability to control completely. Dr. Sab Webb observed from behind one-way mirrors, taking notes on how George responded to stress, processed conflicting information, and interacted with authority figures who were looking to him for guidance despite his obvious youth. George initially struggled with the simulation, making several decisions that the debriefers later explained would have had serious negative consequences. He had prioritized saving historical buildings over rescuing people in immediate danger, allocated resources based on political considerations rather than genuine need, and failed to communicate effectively with international partners who could have provided crucial assistance. But Hartwell and his team weren't disappointed by George's initial failures. The point of the exercises was to let him make mistakes in a safe environment where the consequences were educational rather than real. Over subsequent sessions, George learned to ask better questions, seek diverse perspectives before making decisions, and maintain focus on humanitarian priorities even when facing political pressure. Dr. Chen expanded George's international education with what she called diplomatic immersion experiences. These sessions involved George interacting with real foreign diplomats and cultural representatives who had been carefully vetted and sworn to secrecy about his identity. They believed they were participating in an educational program for gifted young people from prominent British families. Through these interactions, George learned how different cultures approached concepts of leadership, authority, and social responsibility. He practiced conversations in French and Spanish, languages he was already studying at school, but with the specific goal of conducting meaningful discussions about policy and philosophy, rather than ordering meals or asking for directions. A Chinese cultural attaché taught George about the concept of the mandate of heaven and how Chinese citizens viewed the relationship between rulers and the ruled. An Islamic scholar from Morocco explained the principles of consultation and consensus building that guided leadership in many Muslim societies. A representative from the German parliament discussed how democratic institutions could coexist with constitutional monarchies in modern Europe. These conversations were eye-opening for George, showing him that his future role would require understanding and respecting worldviews that were fundamentally different from British traditions. He began to appreciate how the Commonwealth's diversity would require him to navigate between competing cultural values while maintaining unity among nations with very different approaches to governance and social organization. The technological aspects of George's training evolved rapidly, as his instructors recognized his natural aptitude for understanding complex systems. Captain Rodriguez introduced him to advanced concepts in information warfare, showing him how state actors and non-state groups used social media platforms, deepfake technology, and coordinated disinformation campaigns to destabilize democratic institutions. George learned to identify sophisticated manipulation techniques, understanding how his own image and words could be weaponized by hostile actors seeking to undermine the monarchy or British interests more generally. He practiced analyzing viral social media content to determine whether posts were genuine grassroots expressions or artificially amplified propaganda designed to create the appearance of widespread public opinion. The prince also began learning about cybersecurity from a defensive perspective, understanding how royal communications could be intercepted and manipulated by foreign intelligence services. He practiced using encrypted communication methods and learned to recognize potential security vulnerabilities in his digital interactions. Rodriguez emphasized that future monarchs would need to be aware of technological threats that previous generations never could have imagined. The ability to create convincing fake videos or audio recordings meant that George would need to be constantly vigilant about protecting his image and ensuring that his authentic communications could be distinguished from sophisticated forgeries. Physical training intensified as George's body matured and he became capable of more demanding exercises. Major Walsh introduced him to combat sports, not because he would ever fight physically as king, but because the mental discipline and strategic thinking required in martial arts would serve him well in political and diplomatic contexts. George learned boxing, jiu-jitsu, and tactical movement techniques used by protection officers. The training built his physical confidence while teaching him to remain calm under pressure and think strategically when faced with rapidly changing situations. Walsh explained that physical courage and mental toughness were interconnected, and that a king who could handle himself physically would project strength that could be valuable during international negotiations or domestic crises. The prince also began training in advanced driving techniques, learning to maintain control of vehicles under various emergency conditions. While he would always have professional drivers for official duties, Walsh explained that circumstances might arise where George needed to drive himself or others to safety, particularly during security emergencies or natural disasters. These sessions took place at a private facility where George learned defensive driving, evasive maneuvers, and basic pursuit techniques. He practiced maintaining composure while navigating through simulated protests, handling vehicles on various road surfaces during adverse weather, and communicating via radio while concentrating on driving tasks. Dr. Webb's psychological training moved into more advanced territory as George demonstrated his ability to understand complex human motivations and social dynamics. The sessions now included training in negotiation techniques, crisis counseling principles, and advanced leadership psychology. George learned to recognize signs of mental health struggles in people around him, understanding that future interactions with government ministers, foreign leaders, and ordinary citizens would sometimes involve individuals dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, or other psychological challenges. He practiced responding appropriately to these situations while maintaining professional boundaries and knowing when to recommend professional help. The prince also studied historical examples of how previous monarchs had handled mental health challenges in their own lives and families. Dr. Webb used these case studies to help George understand that seeking help for psychological difficulties was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that future kings needed to model healthy approaches to mental wellness for their subject. Advanced communication training became increasingly important as George's voice matured and he began to develop his own speaking style. Professional speech coaches worked with him to project authority while maintaining warmth, to handle hostile questioning from media representatives, and to deliver difficult news in ways that would be received constructively by various audiences. George practiced giving speeches about controversial topics, learning to acknowledge different viewpoints while maintaining constitutional neutrality. He rehearsed responding to gotcha questions from journalists seeking to create controversy, developing the ability to redirect conversations toward more productive topics while avoiding obvious evasion that would undermine his credibility. The prince also learned about the power of symbolic communication, understanding how his choice of clothing, body language, and even which events he chose to attend would send messages that could be more influential than formal speeches. These lessons connected back to his earlier training in reading human behavior, as he learned to project specific messages through nonverbal communication. Family dynamics at Adelaide Cottage evolved as George's training progressed, and his understanding of his future responsibilities deepened. His parents noticed increasing maturity in how he approached conflicts with his siblings, handled disappointment about canceled plans, and discussed current events during family meals. William and Catherine were proud of George's development, but also concerned about ensuring he maintained healthy relationships with Charlotte and Louis. The secret training created an inevitable distance between George and his siblings, who remained unaware of the extraordinary education their older brother was receiving. To address this challenge, the family instituted weekly ordinary time periods when George was explicitly encouraged to act like a normal child without any consideration for his future role. These sessions included video games, silly movies, playground visits, and other activities designed to preserve elements of normal childhood experience. Catherine particularly emphasized creative activities that had no connection to royal duties or leadership development. She encouraged George's interest in art and music, arranging private lessons that were purely for enjoyment rather than public accomplishment. These creative outlets provided emotional release and helped maintain balance in George's increasingly structured life. The prince's relationship with his grandparents also evolved as his training progressed. King Charles and Queen Camilla were kept informed about the general direction of George's education, but were not involved in day-to-day decisions about curriculum or methods. They represented the traditional approach to royal education, while George's parents had chosen a more contemporary and intensive preparation model. Conversations with his grandparents became more meaningful as George developed sophisticated understanding of constitutional principles and historical precedents. Charles was impressed by his grandson's growing grasp of complex issues, though he sometimes worried that George was being exposed to harsh realities too early in life. George found himself torn between respecting traditional royal customs that his grandparents valued and embracing innovative approaches that his training emphasized. This tension reflected broader questions about how the monarchy should evolve to remain relevant in rapidly changing times, while preserving institutional continuity and public respect. School life at Lambrook became more complicated as George's external training influenced his classroom performance and social interactions. His teachers noticed dramatic improvements in his analytical thinking, historical knowledge, and ability to discuss complex topics, but they also observed that he sometimes seemed distracted or preoccupied with concerns beyond typical childhood interests. George excelled in subjects like geography, history, and current affairs, but he had to be careful not to display knowledge that would be impossible to explain given his official educational background. He learned to moderate his responses during class discussions, sharing insights that were sophisticated but not suspiciously advanced. Friendships with classmates became more challenging as George's worldview expanded beyond typical teenage concerns. He found it difficult to relate to peers who worried about sports teams, video games, and social media drama, when his own thoughts were increasingly occupied with geopolitical challenges and constitutional responsibilities. The prince developed strategies for maintaining normal social relationships while protecting the secrets of his advanced training. He learned to show appropriate interest in age-appropriate topics, while privately processing much more serious concerns about his future role and the challenges facing the country he would one day lead. By the end of his first full year of intensive training, George had developed capabilities and knowledge that exceeded most university graduates in fields related to leadership, international relations, and crisis management. But he was still a teenager learning to navigate the normal challenges of adolescence while carrying extraordinary secrets and responsibilities. The next phase of his education would push him even further beyond conventional royal preparation, testing his abilities in ways that would determine whether he was truly ready to become the kind of king that 21st century Britain would need. The autumn of George's 13th year marked a dramatic escalation in both the complexity and intensity of his secret preparation. Colonel Hartwell had concluded that the prince was ready for what he called operational training, real-world experiences that would test everything George had learned while providing him with authentic exposure to the challenges he would face as king. The first operational exercise came disguised as a family holiday to Scotland. While the official itinerary showed typical royal activities like visiting historic castles and meeting local dignitaries, the reality was far more sophisticated. George was secretly participating in a multi-day crisis simulation that involved real government officials, military personnel, and intelligence operatives who believed they were conducting a routine training exercise. The scenario centered around a simulated terrorist attack on critical infrastructure that had disrupted power grids across northern England and southern Scotland. George, still known to most participants only as Arthur, was placed in a specially created role as a youth representative providing input on how younger generations would respond to the crisis and what communication strategies might be most effective for reaching diverse demographics. What made this simulation extraordinary was that George was actually providing genuine advice that influenced real contingency planning. His insights about social media communication patterns gained through Captain Rodriguez's training helped refine actual government protocols for crisis communication. His understanding of regional differences across the United Kingdom, developed through Dr. Chen's cultural education, contributed to more effective resource allocation strategies that would be used in actual emergencies. George found himself sitting in emergency coordination meetings with senior military officers, intelligence analysts, and cabinet-level officials who had no idea they were receiving strategic advice from the future king. His suggestions were evaluated purely on their merit, giving him authentic feedback about his readiness to contribute meaningfully to national decision-making processes. The exercise revealed both strengths and areas where George needed additional development. His analytical thinking was remarkably sophisticated for his age, and his ability to understand complex interconnections between different aspects of the crisis impressed seasoned professionals. However, he still sometimes deferred too quickly to adult authority figures and needed to develop greater confidence in advocating for positions he believed were correct, even when facing disagreement from experienced officials. Webb used the exercise as an opportunity to study George's psychological responses to sustained high-stress situations. The simulation ran continuously for 72 hours, with George maintaining his cover identity while processing enormous amounts of information and contributing to consequential decisions. Webb was pleased to observe that George remained calm and focused throughout the exercise, never breaking character or revealing information that would compromise his secret identity. Following the Scotland exercise, George's training schedule expanded to include monthly shadow deployments, where he would accompany various government officials and military personnel on their routine duties while maintaining his cover identity as a student researcher or intern from an unnamed educational institution. These experiences gave George unprecedented insight into how Britain actually functioned beyond the ceremonial aspects of government that traditional royal education emphasized. He spent time with Foreign Office analysts processing intelligence reports about international developments, accompanied Treasury officials to meetings about economic policy implementation, and observed Home Office personnel dealing with immigration and security issues. During one memorable deployment, George accompanied a team of British diplomats to Geneva for United Nations climate negotiations. His role was ostensibly to observe and report on youth perspectives for an academic project, but he was actually learning firsthand how international agreements were negotiated, how national interests were balanced against global cooperation, and how British representatives advanced the country's positions in multilateral settings. The experience was both educational and sobering. George witnessed the frustrating complexity of international negotiations, where technical experts spent hours debating seemingly minor language changes that had enormous practical implications. He observed how representatives from different countries used various strategies to advance their agendas, from straightforward advocacy to sophisticated psychological manipulation. More importantly, George began to understand how Britain's role in international affairs was changing as other nations gained economic and political influence. He saw how British negotiators had to work harder than previous generations to maintain relevance and influence, relying increasingly on soft power, historical relationships, and strategic alliance building rather than economic dominance or military strength. The climate negotiations also exposed George to the generational tensions that would define much of his reign. Younger activists and representatives from developing nations were increasingly impatient with incremental approaches to environmental challenges, while established powers were reluctant to make commitments that might disadvantage their economies. George realized that his role as king would often involve mediating between these competing perspectives while maintaining Britain's interests and values. Physical training evolved during this period to include survival skills and tactical awareness that went far beyond the exercise programs George had been following. Exercise photographics for many recipes. Major Walsh introduced him to wilderness survival techniques, advanced first aid procedures, and basic counterintelligence measures that might be necessary if he ever found himself in hostile territory or dangerous situations. These skills were taught not because George would likely need them during normal royal duties, but because Walsh believed that comprehensive preparation required readiness for extraordinary circumstances. Historical examples of monarchs who had been captured, threatened, or forced to flee their countries provided sobering reminders that even constitutional monarchs could face personal danger during periods of political instability or international conflict. George learned to navigate using map and compass, construct emergency shelters, purify water from natural sources, and signal for rescue using various methods. He practiced basic medical procedures that might be necessary during disasters or emergencies when professional help was unavailable. He also learned to recognize surveillance techniques and take basic precautions against electronic monitoring or physical tracking. The training was demanding and sometimes frightening for someone still in his early teens, but George approached it with the same determination he had shown throughout his secret education. Walsh emphasized that these skills would ideally never be needed, but that a responsible leader should be prepared for scenarios that might seem unlikely but could have catastrophic consequences if they occurred without preparation. Technological education reached new levels of sophistication as George's instructors recognized his exceptional aptitude for understanding complex digital systems. Captain Rodriguez introduced him to advanced cybersecurity concepts, including basic penetration testing techniques and digital forensics principles, that would help him understand how cyber attacks were conducted and detected. George learned to use specialized software for analyzing digital communications, identifying deepfake content, and tracing the origins of disinformation campaigns. These skills were particularly relevant given the increasing use of cyber warfare techniques by state and non-state actors seeking to influence democratic processes or destabilize Western institutions. The prince also began learning about quantum computing concepts and artificial intelligence applications that would likely transform society during his reign. Rodriguez explained how these technologies could be used both constructively for solving complex problems and destructively for surveillance, manipulation, or cyber attacks that could cripple critical infrastructure. George practiced using various secure communication platforms and learned to implement operational security measures that would protect sensitive information during his future role. He understood that royal communications would always be targets for hostile intelligence services, criminal organizations, and malicious actors seeking to embarrass or blackmail the monarchy. Dr. Chen expanded George's international education to include intensive language study and cultural immersion experiences that prepared him for effective communication with leaders from diverse backgrounds. Beyond his existing French and Spanish studies, George began learning Mandarin, Arabic, and Hindi, recognizing that future British monarchs would need to engage directly with leaders from rapidly growing economies and politically influential regions. The language training went beyond basic conversation skills to include understanding cultural nuances, religious concepts, and historical perspectives that influenced how different societies approached governance, conflict resolution, and international cooperation. George learned that effective diplomacy required deep appreciation for how various cultures understood concepts like honor, respect, compromise, and authority. Cultural immersion exercises involved George interacting with native speakers through video conferences and virtual reality systems that simulated diplomatic meetings, cultural ceremonies, and informal social interactions. He practiced conducting meaningful conversations about complex topics while navigating cultural sensitivities that could easily lead to misunderstandings or offense if handled incorrectly. These experiences taught George that successful international leadership required constant learning and adaptation, as he encountered new cultures and perspectives throughout his reign. The world was becoming increasingly interconnected, but also more culturally complex as globalization brought different traditions and values into closer contact and sometimes conflict. Advanced psychological training helped George develop sophisticated understanding of group dynamics, mass psychology, and the emotional factors that influenced political behavior. Dr. Webb introduced concepts from behavioral economics, social psychology, and cognitive science that explained how people made decisions, how public opinion was formed and changed, and how leaders could communicate effectively with diverse audiences. George learned to recognize cognitive biases that affected both individual decision-making and collective behavior during crises. He studied historical examples of how fear, nationalism, economic anxiety, and social change had influenced political movements throughout British history. He practiced analyzing contemporary political developments using these psychological frameworks to better understand underlying motivations and likely future developments. The training also included emotional intelligence development that would help George manage his own psychological responses to the enormous stresses of royal duty, while maintaining empathy and connection with people facing various challenges. Dr. Webb emphasized that effective leadership required understanding and managing both personal emotions and the emotional dynamics of groups and organizations. George practiced techniques for maintaining mental clarity during high-stress situations, developing emotional resilience that would help him make sound decisions even when facing criticism, failure, or personal attacks. He learned that future kings needed to be psychologically strong enough to handle inevitable controversies and conflicts, while remaining open to feedback and willing to acknowledge mistakes when they occurred. Family relationships continued evolving as George's training progressed, and his understanding of his future responsibilities deepened further. His parents noticed that he was becoming more serious and thoughtful, sometimes seeming older than his years during family discussions about current events or personal challenges. William and Catherine worked carefully to maintain balance between supporting George's extraordinary preparation and preserving his relationship with Charlotte and Louis. They instituted family activities that had nothing to do with royal duties or future responsibilities, creating space for normal sibling interactions and childhood experiences. The secret nature of George's training created inevitable complications for family dynamics. Charlotte had begun asking questions about George's frequent absences and obvious knowledge about topics that seemed advanced for his age. Louis was too young to understand fully, but he sometimes seemed confused by George's mature responses to situations that would typically cause teenage frustration or excitement. George himself struggled with the isolation created by his secret education. He couldn't share his experiences or concerns with his siblings, school friends, or extended family members. The knowledge he was gaining was both exciting and burdensome, creating a sense of responsibility that sometimes felt overwhelming for someone still in his early teens. His parents arranged for George to have regular sessions with a specially cleared child psychologist, who could help him process the emotional challenges of his unique situation without compromising operational security. These conversations provided George with a safe space to discuss his fears, frustrations, and questions about his future role without risking exposure of the secret training program. The psychologist helped George develop healthy coping mechanisms for handling the pressure of his extraordinary education, while maintaining emotional connections with people who remained unaware of his advanced preparation. These sessions were crucial for ensuring that George's psychological development remained healthy, despite the unusual circumstances of his upbringing. Academic performance at Lambrook continued to excel as George's training enhanced his analytical abilities and broadened his knowledge base across multiple subjects. However, he had to be increasingly careful about not displaying information or perspectives that would be impossible to explain given his official educational background. George developed sophisticated strategies for engaging in classroom discussions and completing assignments in ways that demonstrated intelligence and maturity, without revealing the extent of his advanced knowledge. He learned to ask questions that would guide conversations toward topics he found interesting, while allowing other students to contribute insights that kept discussions balanced and age-appropriate. Teachers consistently praised George's thoughtful contributions to class discussions and his ability to analyze complex topics from multiple perspectives. They attributed his intellectual development to excellent private tutoring and natural intelligence, rather than suspecting any extraordinary educational experiences. Social relationships with classmates became more challenging as George's worldview continued expanding beyond typical teenage concerns. He found it increasingly difficult to relate to peers whose primary interests involved sports, entertainment, and social media drama, while his own thoughts were occupied with geopolitical challenges, constitutional questions, and the enormous responsibilities awaiting him in the future. George developed careful strategies for maintaining normal friendships while protecting the secrets of his advanced training. He learned to show appropriate interest in age-appropriate topics while internally processing much more serious concerns about climate change, international conflicts, economic instability, and social changes that would shape the world he would eventually lead. By his 14th birthday, George had developed capabilities and knowledge that exceeded most university graduates in fields related to leadership, international relations, crisis management, and strategic communication. He could analyze intelligence reports, participate meaningfully in high-level policy discussions, operate advanced technology systems, and interact effectively with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. More importantly, George had developed the emotional maturity and ethical foundation necessary to handle the enormous pressures and responsibilities of modern monarchy. His training had prepared him not just to wear a crown, but to provide genuine leadership during whatever challenges the 21st century might bring to Britain and the Commonwealth. The secret education that had begun 2 years earlier was nearing its initial completion phase, though George's preparation would continue in various forms throughout his teenage years and early adulthood. He was becoming the kind of monarch that Britain would need in an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world, though the full test of his readiness would only come when he eventually inherited the responsibilities that his secret training had been designed to prepare him for. The future king was ready for the next phase of his extraordinary journey toward a throne that would demand everything his hidden education had taught him, and more.